Hello friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters. Chapters is a show here on Armstrong Cable Television that profiles authors, editors, and publishers. And we're delighted to have you with us today. I'm Carter Seaton, and I'm the host. And today our guest is poet Philip St. Clair. Philip was born in Warren, Ohio in 1944. I probably shouldn't be telling your age, should I? After the graduation from high school, he enlisted in the United States Air Force. He then later attended Kent State University, received his BA, MA, and MLS degrees. In 1985, he earned an MFA in poetry from Bowling Green State University. In addition to his work as a librarian, a bartender, and a writer-editor-indexer, he served as an adjunct instructor at Kent State University, at Bowling Green State, and as a lecturer at Southern Illinois University. And in the fall of 1991, he received a tenure-track appointment at Ashland Community and Technical College, where he once served as the chairman of the Humanities Council and directed the Jesse Stewart Writers Conference. He retired from ACTC in 2010 and now lives with his wife Christina in Ashland, Kentucky. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
We're delighted. Your poems and the cover of your book are both beautiful. They contain such wonderful images. I want to know first, we've got a lot to talk about the poems themselves, but how did poetry become your passion, or has it always been? Since you got an MFA in poetry, I guess that's where you first started.
I think it was when I was coming up, being an adolescent, it was really the only thing I was interested in.
Really?
So I had, I was a typical overweight, nerdy kid with, the tape on the glasses and all that sort of thing. So, and I was one of those intelligent kids that simply weren't motivated. And one of the things that I did find interesting was poetry. So I was good at that in high school and junior high, and terrible at the other stuff, which suited me fine.
When did you first? I mean, what poets were you introduced to at that point when you were young?
Well, it was the usual thing one gets in high school, in the anthologies of British lit and American lit and that sort of thing.
So Wordsworth and things like that?
Yeah, all of that, all of the canonical, from Chaucer all the way through the Romantics, right, and T.S. Eliot and all that sort of thing. And some of the moderns up to Edgar Lee Masters was, I think, a particular influence for me, because it was his poems were biographical rather, and I sort of learned what the shape of a poem ought to be from Spoon River Anthology. So his example carried with me, and Allen Ginsberg, Howl was like a thunderbolt. It was, I was just totally taken by the imagery and the force and the prophetic statements. The political, he was a political maverick when it wasn't the fashion to be a political maverick. And of course the beats were newsworthy. Everybody was interested in the beats because they were radical and they had long hair and snapped their fingers and played bongo drums and did all sorts of outrageous things. So being a high school rebel, I would say this is for me.
Yeah, right.
And there's also a spiritual element, I think, to the beats.
Do you find that poetry allows you to use imagery better than prose? Did you ever try prose?
Not really, no.
You just stuck with that.
I always felt that the image was the primal thing to go for. And then secondly would be the sound values, and then last but certainly not least was the shape. John Ciardi, I think, used the term containment, as in what container or what shape the poem ought to be housed in.
How do you determine that?
Whatever seems right. Many times I'll start working on a poem and it just seems like an instinct to divide it up into certain stanzas and certain length. The poems many of the poems, most of the poems in that book have a certain shape to them, 16 long lines and 16 short lines. And I was experimenting with the short lines and the long lines and did a few drafts that I thought were pretty good, and decided, well, why don't we just make a form out of that? So I took a couple of drafts and averaged out the number of lines and came up with not 16, 14 short lines and 14 long lines. And it occurred to my crazed brain that it was like sonnets on sonnets on steroids. So that's what I called them. And
Yeah,
the early poems were, some of the later ones were longer, but the early poems.
Because I was just going to say that when I went to college, we almost always read the very classical poetry that was either sonnets or many of them were rhyming. And now we tend to see much more, very few rhyming
True,
poets,
there are some poets who still work with rhyme, yeah.
but not many, and it's mostly free verse. When did that become kind of the standard for most poets? Do you know? Or did it
I would suppose it would be around, it would be around 1910, I think, is just when people usually regard the modernists, when Ezra Pound started that, and a lot of it was a revulsion against, they were called the Georgian Poets from right after Victoria. They called it the Georgian, and people looked at that and said, well, this is, some of the more advanced people looked at those works and said, this is all full of false sentimentality and bourgeois values, so let's just throw that all out. And yeah. But I think you know, poets like the Romantics and like Keats and Shelley, and especially before like Alexander Pope, that's the way those folks thought.
Yes.
So it was like very natural to them, and I think strict adherence to some kind of form will force you to pay more attention to the poem. Working with those forms, it let me search for the right word and the right combinations of words, and sort of insisted that I pay attention. So just to get them to fit was for me helpful.
So the words, that's another thing I think, when we're writing prose and telling a story, often there's not a big emphasis on the word selection as you're telling the story, because there's certain words you just have to use. But in poetry, that seems to be a little different. You very carefully pick the words that will convey the image you're trying to get people to see.
Best words, best order is the
Right.
is the cliche of what we're after. But
You mentioned earlier that some poetry, and some of it that you knew about and that you liked, was biographical. Do you consider many of the poems in here biographical?
some of them are for sure biographical, and others are, you know, I think poets write about what interests them. I was reading an article about the gal who wrote the, there's the words, Hilary Mantel, who wrote the trilogy. Now there's an article on her, and she was said, well, you know, people write about what they're interested in, obviously. So when she was working on her trilogy, she decided she would go back and look through all of the themes that the themes that were important to her as she was doing her work. And so that became sort of the canon. So, you know, and I think that's also a statement about the poet or writer himself, herself. What are you interested in, and what are you really writing about? Are you writing about, you know, cooking lasagna, or are you writing about your pet chinchilla, or he done him wrong, or she done her, you know?
Right. Do you consider this a chapbook?
No, it's a full-length book.
A full-length book. And do you feel like it's got a theme?
If it is, it comes after the fact.
Okay.
One of the most difficult things in that book, I think many poets face, is how do you arrange
Yes.
disparate poems in a certain sequence. There is a certain sequence to that, but don't ask me to describe it. I think it goes from, conventional, concrete stuff back into the spiritual and the very strange. So there is a progression of sorts, but don't ask me to get real specific
Well, and then there's the
about
other
it.
question as to how do you choose what poems to go in a book?
Usually they're the ones that get published.
So have you published some of these before in anthologies
Almost
and
all
in
of them.
Literary
Yeah,
journals?
almost all of them
I
got
see.
published, and I'd say about 90% of them were published in journals.
Is that the case with some of your other collections? You've got 8 different collections
More
of
or less,
poetry.
yeah,
so
more or
that's-
less.
Yeah. According to the bio, you mopped floors in the college student union, and you tended bar. Obviously, at least that last thing influences one of the poems in here called Disaffected. I noticed that
Because
there's...
I spent a lot of time on the other side of the bar too, besides behind the bar. So
Yes, I hear you.
Disaffected
Right.
was a product of me being
Of
on
both sides?
on the other side of the bar
Oh, I
with
see.
a drink in
Okay.
my hand rather than
Yeah.
one I was going to give one to go to a patron.
And many of them also talk about the working class experience, like Smitty, for instance. Is that drawing on your experience or maybe on your parents' experience?
Well, my parents came from working class people. My old man worked in a mill. I wasn't quite sure what he did because he didn't want to talk about it, and we weren't that close, so I never asked him. But I think he worked in stamping plants and rolling mills in Warren Youngstown area. Youngstown's in the news every so often with the Lordstown plant and all of the vicissitudes of being in the Rust Belt and all that. But I did work for a brief time in a factory that produced PCV pipe
I see.
fittings and all. It didn't stay very long, but I worked there, and there was this guy that's
Smitty.
that was Smitty. That's what he did. So.
Yeah. What about the title poem, Red Cup, Green Lawn? Where did that come from?
Mostly it was a fantasy. I was driving through a residential area and everything was immaculately trimmed and policed, and like your husband would have probably had
Wanted
a
it.
seizure would if he saw it. And all of a sudden there was this red cup laying there, and I thought, oh man. So I thought there was a poem there somewhere, so I started working on that idea, that simple image of the red cup in this immaculate neighborhood, and that's where my imagination ran crazy, and as it usually does. And so.
Do you, when you are driving around like that, do you take notes to yourself to remind you? You know, I'm a list taker, I'm a note taker.
Yeah.
Do you do that?
I used to if I had the free hand, but anymore, whatever sticks in my mind. I think if I can carry it away without having to write a poem about it, write it on my. I used to do that with the varying success.
Some of the other poems are very tender. Reminiscences, for instance, like the one called Grandma. Was that about your
Oh
grandmother?
yeah.
Yeah.
It was about yours.
Yeah.
I'm glad you find it tender. I think
Well,
that would be
she sounded like a pretty feisty
that
lady.
would be
I
the
will-
last.
but
That would be the last adjective. That would be the last modifier I would use for
But-
dear old Granny.
But the memory is still it's a bittersweet one, if you will. Yeah.
It's
I mean, it's
more
kinda
bitter
nice.
than sweet. But it's a long time ago.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of memory, the one called In Remembrance, that one really struck me because I see those stickers. This is about the stickers on the back of a car where there's the father, the mother, the 3 children, the dog, the cat, and so forth. Did you see a sticker like that?
Yeah, I did. I did, and I think after I started the poem, you know, I was mistaken, but I did think I saw this asterisk. And this,
In between
between the
mother and the
mother
children.
and the children, and it occurred to me, well, maybe that's, you know, is it a mystical experience? Is this a road to Damascus experience? And I finally figured out it was a dead child. Maybe it wasn't there. Maybe the asterisk wasn't there at all, but that's what happened in the
Yeah.
that's what happened in the poem.
But that's a very common experience in our lives, I think, is to see that on there. And I always wonder about it because, sometimes we talk about not exposing our families
Oh yeah, yeah. And
to the public, and yet there they are, three kids and two dogs and a cat.
Not wearing our emotions on the sleeve and not being
Right.
so
Right.
open about them.
Yeah. And Secret Agent, tell me about that one.
Ah, Secret Agent. I had a good friend, who told me that story, and it was pretty much like I outlined it. She was the older sister, and one of her tasks, they had a fairly good-sized family, one of her tasks was to put her little brother to bed and tell him a story. And he got to the point where he was getting to be 4 years old. And he started telling her one, and it was all about spies, and as I said in the poem. And one day the whole thing went away from him. And from what I understand about these matters is that when a child gets to be 3 or 4 years old, if there is any remembrance of a past life, it all fades away at that point. So but no, that was based on a true story.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. How you can take something like, for instance, as simple as that sticker on the car and make a whole poem out of it. It's just, it always amazes me how the imagination invents either a story or a poem on some small thing. I think it speaks to the power of observance too. Do you feel like you're hyper observant of things that will catch your attention? Do you try hard to pay attention to things like that?
I think once upon a time I used to go out and just say, well, I'm going to go out and pick myself an image out of my daily life or that sort of. I think I used to do that, but anymore I don't. And I think I spent a lot of time working on those poems that they were already in draft form. But anymore it's just what hits you, and I think the older I get, the more these things hit. But
is that because of memory from things you've seen in the past?
I think so. I think also might be a function of age too. At least I hope it is. That's what I'm.
That's a good thing. That's one of the good things about being older, I guess.
I can't say it, chalk it up to dementia. So
No.
So I'll say, well, I'm just being hyper-imaginative.
There you go.
And age did that to me.
Right.
So.
I particularly like the one called Love Story. And speaking of age, we usually think of that as the young couple's realm. But this is, talk about tender. This one really was very tender. Can you tell us a little bit about that poem?
Sure. That one was based on two family stories. And one of the stories was that World War II was coming to an end, and the telephone rang at 3 o'clock in the morning, and my father stumbles downstairs and stubs his toe on a couch, cusses and swears, and picks up the phone, and here it was my crazy uncle saying, hey, the war is over. The war wasn't over. Okay. So there was that one anecdote which stuck with my head, and Mom got all tight-jawed about that. And the second one was that on another branch of the family, they were living near a river, and the rivers began to rise up. And the mother said, my grandmother said, now don't do it to her two sons, now don't go down and swim in that creek. If you go and swim in that creek or river, you're going to drown, and if you come back drowned, I'm going to tan your hide. So, which everybody, ha ha, tee hee, it's a funny story. So from those two stories, funny stories that two old people sharing reminiscences of many, many years ago.
Right. But I just thought it was,
it was
very tender. Yeah. Do you have a favorite poem in here?
Oh boy. Disaffected is a favorite poem. Dark is a favorite poem, the last one. That worked out quite well. Mummies, one of the first ones.
Would you pick one and read it?
Sure.
There's mummies. Read that one.
Okay. Mummies. They all start out from their very last breath, and what happens to their empty bodies is more or less the same. All fluids dried, joints locked in place, skin stretched tight over cheekbones. 3/4 of what they were before has gone somewhere else. The only real difference is in circumstance. They might spend 70 days under a mound of salt, be carefully swathed in fine linen and laid in a gold sarcophagus, deep in a granite tomb. Or someone might have dug a pit in the sand and put them in it, flexing knees beneath chin, to make the whole world a womb, putting a few bowls of food within their metaphysical reach so they won't get hungry. They might be dressed in furs and beads and laid in a cave high in the Andes or the Sierras, where the wind will whistle over its narrow mouth. They might fall through a crack in a glacier and be freeze-dried. They might get tossed in a peat bog to be tanned like a glove or a saddlebag. Years later, the local police will form a circle around them and complain about paperwork. But when they come to the museum, riddled as sloughed-off bark, light as aluminum, displayed in shatterproof caskets of plexiglass, the morbid and the curious will file past them in reverent silence. Grandma in the funeral home, Uncle Don's wake. And
Yeah. You know what that sort of reminds me of is the Chinese soldiers.
yeah.
I've seen that exhibit a couple of times, and they've got everything in there. They've got horses and food baskets and all sort of things, so that the Chinese emperor won't starve to death, because he thought there would be a whole nother world, and he needed to be ready for it.
I think I started that poem. I was always fascinated by mummies and that sort of thing. I think it started when they found the Iceman, Otzi.
Yes.
The Iceman in the crevasse, yeah.
Yeah.
So that was the
good imagery there. Thank you. So when you were teaching, how did you teach students to write poetry? And did you find resistance, or were they, specifically interested in that like you were when you were young?
I taught mostly composition.
Oh, did you?
When I was in Southern Illinois, I taught basic studies in poetry and fiction. I taught the first course in creative writing, and most of them seemed to be quite eager to do it. And I had certain things I wanted them to do, and I had my certain techniques, and they kind of went ahead and did their own thing. And some of it was pretty interesting, some of it was rather dismal, and I didn't want them to write short stories where the last part is and then I woke up and it was all a dream.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But I think one had to be sort of lenient.
Well, speaking of fiction, do you ever read fiction?
The fiction that I haven't read any contemporary fiction in quite a while. I find myself going back to the tried and the true and Vanity Fair, and I'm rereading Darkness at Noon, and every so often I read the Alexandria Quartet. That's in the book, and trying to summon a name. Oh well, but usually the fiction that I read I've read before.
And now that you've retired, what's your writing routine? Do you have one? No. No. Oh, my goodness.
No, I'm afraid I don't have much of a routine at all. I tend to do a lot of puttering and, read putter, and all that sort of thing. So it took a lot to get that book together, and I think after that book finally did get together, and especially after I stopped marketing it, then I took a break. I'm starting a new project.
You are starting a new project?
I tell people that I'm starting a new project. It's one. I read something about an old man's project. An old man's project is really one of those that'll just take him. It will never be finished. It's just something that he
says he's doing.
That says he's going to do, and he does it. But it's sort of, well, okay, A lot of it goes on up here. And,
right.
if I read this other book, it might give me an insight into this person's character, so I'll read this book. So that's kind of, I'm working on an old man's project.
Well, what happens if something just strikes you and you absolutely have to write it?
Then I'll
you'll sit
go
down
ahead.
and do it.
Then I'll have to. Then I'll be
You'll be
compelled to
forced.
sit down
You'll be
and
forced.
sit down and do it.
Right.
The universe has shifted, so I'll have to
Right.
stop being a putterer and go back to being a writer.
Do you find the submission process for poetry is difficult, or because there are a lot of journals out there?
Yeah.
Is it better than it used to be?
It can be. I think it's a lot better than it was. There's simply more of them. And the simple fact that they let you do submissions electronically is very interesting. So you don't have to print and lick stamps and wait for the mail. So
Right.
usually it's pretty effective.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot better than it used to be. But on the other hand, there are a lot more journals and a lot of online stuff, which
I
is.
was just going to
yeah.
ask about that. Yeah, there are a lot of.
I would
online
prefer to be in
journals.
print, but I've kind of, in the fullness of time, I've kind of made peace with electronic submissions and online. Used to be I said, oh, I will never do that.
Do you think that the readership of online journals is as strong as it is for print journals? I mean, so many people now are going to reading almost everything that they read online. I wonder if that's the same
I
with
don't know. I
journals.
guess I never really thought about it. I'm pretty much of a 20th century fellow,
Yeah.
and just
I want it in my hand.
resist. I resist. I resist the 21st century and its blandishments.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to not lock in on the tech and all this sort of thing. And recently, I had my credit card hacked, and I had to redo this and redo that, and I found it terrible because
Yeah.
I'm just not used to doing it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I resist it.
Yeah. I do listen to Audible books when I have a chance to walk the dog or something. And I had a Kindle account, but I almost never read that way. I buy them, and then I think, no, I really want the paper book, and I go out
I'm
and buy
like
the
that
book.
too. I take phases. Sometimes I'll get into the Kindle and take it with me when I go and get a cup of coffee in the morning, and
Right.
sometimes I don't. But they're awfully handy.
Yeah.
I do like the Kindles.
And particularly if you're going to travel, it's one device for about 4 books if you're going to be gone any length of time.
But I do like the book.
Physical book.
But I like them both. I can
Yeah.
live with them both. But I tend to gravitate toward the book.
Right. Right. So, do you have a favorite poet?
No, actually. I have a number of them that I appreciate,
Yeah.
and certain poems that I appreciate. But as far as a favorite poet, I've got,
A list.
there's a brief list, yeah.
Well, I will look forward to whatever comes out of the old man's project
So will I.
and hope that it's something that you'll come back and talk to us about.
I would be happy to.
At some
Just
point.
give me about another 20, 30 years.
Okay,
and
that's a deal.
We'll see about that.
All righty. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for doing this. This was
And that's
fun.
about all the time we have for today, and I thank you all so much for joining us on Chapters. We also want to thank the Inner Geek for providing us our support here and remind you that the books of the authors who have been on our show are usually found here at the Inner Geek. And if you have not checked out the rest of Armstrong Television's programming, be sure to do that too. It's news you can use. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Connect with Chapters via email. Write to lp4@zoom.email. Chapters has a Facebook page at Armstrong Chapters. Like, subscribe, and follow. All chapter episodes are available on YouTube. Visit Armstrong's YouTube channel. Follow Armstrong. And look for a playlist of all the Chapters programs.